Hello, this is WJHS 91.5 The Eagle, and you're listening to our October Spooky Stories read thing. Let's get started. Ted Martin and Sam Miller were good friends. They spent a lot of time together. On this particular night, they were sitting on a fence near a post office, talking about one thing and another. There was a field of turnips across the road. Suddenly, they saw something crawl out of the field and stand up. It looked like a man, but in the dark it was hard to tell for sure. Then it was gone. But soon it appeared again. It walked halfway across the road, then it turned around and went back into the field. Then it came out a third time and started toward them. By now, Ted and Sam were scared, and they started to run. But when they finally stopped, they decided they were being foolish. They weren't sure what had scared them, so they decided to go back and get a better look. Pretty soon they saw it, for it was coming to meet them. It was wearing black pants, a white shirt, and black suspenders. Sam said, "Hey, I'm going to try and touch it, and we'll know if it's real." He walked up to it and peered into its face. It had bright, penetrating eyes sunk deep in its head. It looked like a skeleton. Ted took one look and screamed, and again he and Sam ran, but this time the skeleton followed them. When they got to Ted's house, they stood in the doorway and watched it. It stayed out on the road for a while, then it disappeared. A year later, Ted got sick and died. Toward the end, Sam sat up with him every night. The night Ted died, Sam said he looked just like the skeleton. One time, a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in this settlement. This house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they always would get scared out by the haunt. So this preacher took his Bible and went to the house, went on in and built himself a fire, a good fire, and he lit a lamp, sat there reading the Bible. Then, just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. Then it sounded like somebody was trying to scream and got choked off. Then there was a lot of threshing around and struggling, and finally everything got quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. Saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back easy-like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and read a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and went to mending the fire. The haunt started walking up again, and step, 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 up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat, watching the door, saw the doorknob turn, the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed, like she didn't know what to do. Then she just faded out. The old preacher waited, and when he didn't hear any more noises, he went over and shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man, and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again, slowly. Step, 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 step. Closer and closer, step, step. And it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible up before him. Then the knob slowly turned and the door opened wide. This time the preacher spoke quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Ghost, who are you, and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room straight to him and took hold of his coat. It was a young woman about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled. The flesh was dropping off her face so he could see the bones and parts of her teeth. She had no eyeballs, but there was a sort of blue light way back in her sockets, and she had no nose on her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming along with the wind blowing it. She told her how her lover had killed her for money and buried her in the cellar. She said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. Then she told him to take the end joint of the little finger from his left hand and lay it in the collection plate at the next church meeting, and he'd find out who had murdered her. And she said, "If you come back here once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where the money is hid. You can give it to the church." The haunt sobbed like she was tired, and she sunk down toward the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate. When a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at the bone, trying to get it off. Then he went to screaming like he was going crazy. Well, he confessed to the murder, and they took him down to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to the house one midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the hearth rock. He did, and he found a big sack of money. and where the haunted held onto his coat, the print of those burnt, bony fingers was burned right into the cloth, and it never did come out. And thank you to listening for those 2 stories. I hope you enjoyed. Those were 2 short excerpts from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz, namely The Thing and The Haunted House, adapted and performed by myself, Alex Skinner. If you enjoyed this story, you can find more stories like this one and other projects from our media studios. Search for a channel called WJHS Studios. Thank you again for listening.